30. Cas had no idea how long they'd been walking. Everything down here looked, smelled, and sounded the same. He couldn't even be sure if Marshall hadn't taken them in one giant circle to stall them. He'd given up asking the man questions. The main goal was to find Evie and Laura, and then get the hell out of this creepy place. "Box, how far have we gone since I asked you to keep track?" Cas asked. 1,645 meters. 46 meters. 47. Thank you, Cas replied. Based on the distance we've traveled, can you extrapolate a rough shape of this thing we're in? We've been on a steady, if shallow, decline, Box replied. And based on the turns we've made, averaging them out, I'd say the maze is built into the same pyramid shape we saw on the surface, except upside down. Though it was straight for a while, now we're tapering. Cas turned to Jan. That's exactly like the one we saw at Omicron, he said. Remember? The cube with all the, tetrahexahedron, Jan replied. Yeah, kinda hard to forget a stone tetra in space. The pyramid on the surface must just be one side of it. That's pretty much it, Marshall said. These structures are buried all over this planet. Each one has control over a different bubble of time. Okay, see, now that's helpful, Cas said. Why couldn't you have said that before? Because, honestly, I don't answer to you, Caspian. And I'm not afraid of you, or what you might do to me, which in truth is very little. You may think you've got the upper hand here, but I can assure you that's not the case. Cas couldn't help but ball his fists. Don't let him get to you, Jan whispered, leaning in close. Let's just figure this out. He took a breath. So if this pyramid controls its own time bubble, then it's likely the other pyramid we saw controlled the other bubble, at the giant arch in space. So the athru built these structures for what? What purpose could be gained? Jan shrugged. Camouflage, for one. They could have hidden an entire navy in that system, and we wouldn't have known it. But I don't think that's the end of it. The athru didn't build these structures, Marshall said from in front of them. They were already here when they arrived on this planet over 2,000 years ago. They don't know who built them or where they came from. It's funny, Cas said. When I'm not asking questions, you seem to find a way to give us a lot of information. It's only when I don't. Marshall put his finger to his lips, pointing with his other hand down the corridor. Cas glanced down to see a source of light coming from an adjacent hallway. Is this it? He mouthed. Marshall nodded. Cas turned to Jan, who already had her weapon off her back and hot in her hands. He tapped Box on the shoulder. Weapons? He whispered. Just these, Box said, making fists. Shock and awe. You named your hands? Cas asked, deadpan. Hey, these hands have kicked an insane amount of ass in the past season. So yes, they deserved names. Also, I have a pulse pistol stored in my side compartment. Great, Cas thought. The last time he'd been in a fight with Box had been back on the Atlas, in which he proceeded to throw things at their enemies. His primary method of fighting seemed to be throwing things. Why would he want to use the pistol? He nodded to Marshall, who indicated they should follow him. Creeping alongside the wall, they reached the hallway where light spilled in from an adjacent room. Cas peered around the corner to see the room beyond was empty, but with a large stone slab in the middle. It reminded him of an altar. He crouched low, coming out of cover, and made his way along the short hallway until he reached the opening. It was smooth, like it had been carved with no thought given to a door, and he remembered how the door outside had melted away. If every entrance was the same, then the team could get stuck inside. Cas motioned for all of them to stay back. Marshall moved to object, but Cas flared his nostrils, his eyes intense. Marshall stood his ground, but didn't proceed any further. Looking into the room, Cas didn't see any trace of Evie, Laura, or anyone else. It appeared completely empty. Warm light from the sun filtered down what looked to be a very high skylight above him. It probably reached all the way to the top of the pyramid. Then again, there could be another time pocket at work here. The alien could have her trapped behind a second bubble, just out of phase with Cas, or held frozen in time forever. That was the problem with time travel. Everything got all fucked up. Gritting his teeth, he made his decision. Waiting was no longer an option. As he crept into the antechamber, he kept his eyes sharp for anything that might rush him from some dark corner. In the middle of the room was the stone slab, and he approached it, placing his hand on top. It was cool to the touch, though it should be warm with the amount of sunlight coming down from above. Cas squinted as he looked up. It was the only light in this room. He strolled over to a row of what looked like stone tables, but they were arranged in a strange way. If he'd been back on the ship, he would have said these looked like computer terminals. But there were no screens and no control panels, just flat gray stone. Lache, semos elwek. Cas spun, his boom cannon out in front of him. On the other side of the room stood Evie, and beside her, a nearly 2-meter-tall dark gray alien. He'd never seen one before, but it was close enough to match what she described to him. It was one of them, the Andromeda, or athru, or whatever, he didn't care. All that mattered was she was still alive. Evie, step away from him, Cas said. Lush malkamal. Evie spat, her face screwed up in fury and disgust. What the fuck? Cas whispered, glancing between them at the door he'd come through. Evie, get away from it. She revealed a long metal pole in her hand. Cas couldn't imagine how heavy it was, but he wielded it like it was a piece of bamboo. Har mos falem hulk. She walked around the stone table, raising the pole above her head. Oh, no, you don't, Cas said. And he fired a shot at the alien, hitting it square in the chest. It winced, taking a step back, but then righted itself, a smile on its face. That can't be good. He ducked to the side just as Evie brought the pole down right where he'd been standing. A little help in here. Box came charging into the space, jumping over Evie and grabbing one end of the pole. Evie yanked it back, fighting with him. She's much stronger than a human should be, Box yelled. Jan appeared in the opening, one rifle slung right on her hip and the other wrapped around her back. So you're who we've been looking for, she said, opening fire on the alien. About half the shots hit him. He raised his hands to shield his eyes, but didn't fall as the blast struck his body. Cas noticed each place they hit turned black, then morphed back to the gray again. He switched his boom cannon over to projectile and fired, the bullet clipping the arm of the creature. It screamed in response as red blood welled at the wound. Ha! Cas yelled, scrambling up. Box, grab Evie. We have to get her out of here. As if in response, Box went flying past him, smashing into the far wall. Cas turned to see Evie breathing heavily, still holding the pole. She spun it once in her hand and approached him. Cas switched the boom cannon back to energy pulse mode and shot her leg. She faltered, using the pole to prop herself up, then stood again. He's got her under mind control. Kill him. I can't, Jan yelled. He's kind of impervious to this weapon. In response, the creature roared and charged Jan, despite the volley of shots still striking him. She dodged to the side just as he jumped for her, barely missing. She turned and continued to suppress him with fire. Cas turned just in time to see the pole coming down again and jumped to the right as it struck the ground, cracking the stone surface. I'm really sorry, Evie, he said, aiming the gun for her arm, but I don't have a choice. He fired, and the blast struck true. She dropped the pole as she howled in pain. I've got her, Box yelled, coming up behind her and wrapping her in a bear hug. Come on. I could use some help over here, Jan said. The creature had got him back up and was charging her again, even though half her shots were hitting him in the head. Cas flipped the mode on his gun again and took 4 shots, only one of them grazing the creature. But it was enough that he stopped his pursuit and screamed at Cas. Makai lest Ruchan, Evie yelled, and forced Box's arms apart. Cas stared wide-eyed as he heard servos in Box's structure snap from the strain. Evie dropped to the ground and grabbed the pipe again, swinging it around and connecting with Box's head. He fell to the ground in a slump. "Box!" Evie turned back to Cas, hatred in her eyes as she brought the pipe up again. Cas raised his weapon and shot, not thinking. The bullet went straight through her chest, blood blooming at the entry wound, and he heard it ricochet off the back wall. She stood, stunned for a moment, before dropping the pipe. It landed with a clang, and she fell to her knees, looking down at the wound. "No," Cas whispered, looking at the weapon. He'd forgotten to switch it back over. "No, no, no!" From somewhere behind him, Cas heard a shout and a rustle. But all he could do was look into Evie's eyes as she touched the wound, the blood gushing over her hand. She fell to her side, and Cas rushed over to her. Evie, no, I didn't." "Come on," Marshall yelled, grabbing him from behind. "No!" Cas screamed, thrashing against him. In the background, Jan continued to fire her weapon. "No!" he cried again, and then he was in stronger metal arms as he was dragged away from the scene. All he could see from this angle was her back, her dark brown hair splayed on the ground around her. Jan was still trying to fight off the creature. She turned the weapon up to the ceiling, blowing huge chunks off that rained down. "We gotta go," she yelled, retreating to the door they'd come through. Cas didn't understand what was happening. None of that had just occurred. He dreamed it, because Box was carting him away, and Box had been heavily damaged. But when he looked up, he saw 2 of Box's primary neck servos had been destroyed, and there was fluid all over his arms where they had popped. But he was still active. Once all 4 of them were back in the hallway, Jan fired at the ceiling again, until enough debris rained down to completely cover the entrance. "Come on," Marshall said. "We have other concerns." Cas barely heard him. 31. Laura shuffled through the dark corridors. Evie's sword still strapped to her back, and her light not providing much illumination in this maze. She shouldn't have left the others back at the entrance, but they wouldn't quit arguing. And whoever took Evie could be doing unspeakable things to her. She didn't have time to waste waiting around for them. Of course, that was before she'd realized this place was a literal maze, and she had no idea where she was going or how to find Evie. And when she'd backtracked, she'd obviously missed a turn, because she hadn't ended up back at the entrance, instead finding herself in an unrecognizable corridor. Not that they looked any different, but they smelled different. At first, they'd smelled stale. But considering how long she'd been down here, she'd gotten used to it. Each corridor had a slightly different scent, though that fact didn't help her at all. She hadn't wanted to think about it at first, but there was a good chance this might be the place she spent her final hours, lost in an underground tunnel system, hunted by aliens who wanted to destroy the Coalition. It was a sorry end to a short life. If she could just find Evie, maybe everything would be okay. She'd thought of little else for the past 10 weeks. She stopped, rubbed her hands over her eyes, and pulled her hair back behind her. She didn't like how long it had become, but haircuts were a luxury they couldn't afford while those bear things were after them all hours of the day. It seemed like they almost never slept, and with what seemed like unlimited stamina, it was only a matter of time before another one found them again. She'd done her best to protect as many of the crew as possible, but she hadn't been able to save everyone. And those who had survived hadn't done it without cost. There were some, like Raffenkel, who had just retreated into themselves, survival their only concern. Everything else fell to the wayside. Then there were those like herself, who'd kept the hope they hadn't been abandoned, because she knew Evie would never have done that. And she'd been right. They'd come for them. And now it was Laura's turn to find her. She thought she heard a shout and gunshots, but she couldn't be sure. She turned toward the direction of the sounds, picking up the pace into a full-on run, hoping she was going the right way. The shouting and gunshots grew closer, and she could even pick out one of the voices as Jan, but not the others. She wasn't far. At least she didn't think she was when the ground rumbled and she stopped. The ceiling rumbled, and specks of dust rained down on her. Laura refocused and took off running again, though there was nothing now but a few yells. She stopped, straining to make out the words, only for the ground to rumble again. But this time it was stronger. She wasn't sure what was going on, but it gave her a direction to follow, and she broke into another sprint down an adjacent hallway. Her lungs burned and her feet hurt, but she didn't stop. She had to be close. But when she slowed to listen, she didn't hear anything else. No voices, no gunshots, nothing. She wanted to call out. But what if they were all dead? All she'd be doing would be revealing her position. But she was close. If she searched every adjacent corridor from here forward, she should be able to find out where all the commotion had come from. When she reached the first corner, she took the sword, slicing a small nick in the stone of the corner. She replaced the sword and began down the left corridor, alert and ready. "Wait! Just stop! Stop!" Cas yelled. Box was still leading him along the corridor, so fast he almost tripped on his own feet. Box stopped where he was, fluid still leaking from him. "We can't stop," Marshall said. "It will be right behind us." Cas pointed back there with his light. "I've been looking that way this entire time. Do you see anyone back there?" "No, because she's dead, and I fucking killed her." Marshall looked behind Cas, then came up to him. "I know she meant a lot to you, but you have to—" "I don't have to do anything," Cas snapped, knocking Marshall's hand away that had been headed for his shoulder. "And where the hell were you? We were fighting for our lives in there." "I don't have a weapon," Marshall replied. "Left it back at camp." Cas turned away from him, disgusted. "I just don't get it. What did that thing do to her? Why was she fighting us? I told you there might be permanent and irreversible effects. Yes, I heard you." Cas placed his hands on his hips, dropped his head, and took a deep breath. "Cas," Jan said softly, "we need to keep moving. Marshall is right. That thing could be on our trail as we speak. We may have only bought a few minutes." "And I seem to be leaving a trail to follow," Box added. Cas glared down at the black liquid that had leaked from Box. He pulled off his jacket, handing it to the robot. "Rip off the sleeves." Box stared at him. "It's your favorite jacket." "I don't care. Just do it." Box did as he was told, though Cas could tell he had trouble with it. He took each sleeve from Box and wrapped them tight around the leaking servos. They wouldn't solve the problem, but they'd buy them some more time. He slipped the sleeveless jacket back on. "Come on. We don't have time to waste. We still have to disable the dampening field," Marshall said. Cas laughed out loud. "You think we're getting out of this? You think any of us is getting out of this? Look around. We're in the bowels of an underground alien labyrinth on an alien planet thousands of light years away from the Coalition with a ship that can't move. Where are we going to go?" No one said anything. "I didn't think so. We might as well accept our fate. We failed. Half the crew has gone to those things out there. We have no means of leaving the system, even if we got off the planet, and now we've lost two—" His voice cracked, and tears welled in his eyes. "Two captains in under 2 weeks." He turned back the way they came. "So if that bastard wants to come for us, I say we let it. I'm tired of fighting." He couldn't bear this anymore, not after losing Evie. He had thought maybe, with her, they might find a way out of this. But it didn't matter anymore. He'd lost everyone. Uma was gone. Zal was probably dead already. And when Wave 3 finally did show up, they'd find out what the rest of them already knew. This planet was a death trap. He'd even lost himself in a way. Half the organs in his chest weren't even his. "So that's it, then?" Jan said, coming up beside him. "Just because you've given up means everyone else should too? Sounds to me like an exercise in nothing but self-pity." I just don't care anymore, Cas replied.
You think you're the only one? What about the rest of us? We've lost just as much as you. I've lost one of my best friends, my sister, and my commanding officer, twice over with what happened to Captain Diazol in there. But you know what? There are still people up on Tempest counting on us. For them, it's only been moments, and they have no idea what's going on down here. I'm not about to condemn them to an early grave. Are you?
Tears streaming down his face, Cas found he couldn't even face her. He couldn't face the accusations, and turned away.
Fine. Then we'll take care of it.
Where is this dampener control? Jan asked, her face full of disappointment. Not far from here, in a separate antechamber, Marshall replied.
Then let's go. I want to get this thing turned off before that monster finds us. I'm not sure how much longer we'll last against it again.
Cas glanced over.
Last chance. You coming?
He shook his head. She scoffed, turning to Box.
What about you?
I think, he glanced at Cas, my place is here, with him. If the alien comes this way, I'll try to buy you some time.
Thanks.
She took one last look at Cas, and she and Marshall took off jogging in the other direction, their footfalls echoing against the chamber walls. Cas leaned up against the far wall and slid down, resting his arms on his knees, the gun still in his hand. He turned his nose up at it and tossed it down the corridor, where it landed somewhere in the darkness with a thud. Box came over and sat beside him, his lanky frame awkward in the position. I'm sorry about Captain Diazol, he said. I will miss her. She saved my life once. Mine too, he replied. More than once. I guess we should have boarded the Winston after all, Box said. One of the servos in his neck made a small whirring noise. It was out of alignment. Almost did. Why didn't we? Cas asked. Why didn't I just ignore the Admiral's call and get on that ship with you? Because, deep down, you wanted to do the right thing. You always have, even if you try to hide it. Yeah, look where that got me. Even if I was still part of the coalition, they court-martialed me in an instant for so many deaths on my watch. I am a walking death trap. You weren't wrong. Box made a clicking sound from deep within. Yes, I was. If it weren't for you, they would have tried to contact the Sill anyway, and failed. The coalition might even be at war with the Sill, even without the athru threat. Not to mention the most important thing. Cas arched an eyebrow. Which is, you saved me. 'Twould be a dark universe without my glowing, shining presence. Cas snickered. It would indeed. He turned his attention to the dark hallway they'd just come from. What's taking it so long? Why doesn't it just come and finish the job? I don't know. Cas sighed, resigning himself. Box was right. He did always try to do the right thing, no matter the cost. Part of him hated that aspect of himself. It was a burden he'd chosen to bear, despite everything. But if he didn't have his integrity, what was he left with? He stared into the dark hallway, seeking a future for himself he liked even less. You should go on with the others. I'll hold it off. He stood again, searching the ground for where he'd thrown his gun. See? That's just what I'm talking about. You can't help yourself, Box said, not moving. Still trying to do the right thing. Only because if I didn't, I'd never hear the end of it from you. He swept his light back and forth along the ground. That's true. Cas heard the whir of machinery as Box stood behind him. But that's not the real reason. Then by all means, enlighten me. The light picked up a glint of metal, and Cas walked over, picking up the boom cannon. Other than a few scratches, it seemed fine. It's because, even in an unfair world, you've always strived for fairness. Despite everything that's wrong, terrible, and unjust, you can't stand the inequity. and you'll do almost anything to even things out, to make the world a little better." Cas took a deep breath. He didn't like thinking of himself like that, especially after everything that had been done to him. What kind of person was so deluded that after having been betrayed 100 times over, came back to ask for more? A moron, that's who. A deluded moron. And if he was honest with himself, he only pretended to do things because they were in his own self-interest. Otherwise, he never would have come back to the coalition with Evie. She'd been the better of the two of them. She had believed wholeheartedly in the purity of the coalition, and even when presented with evidence to the contrary, had continued to strive to make things better. And she should have been the one who made it out of this place alive. Letting the rest of the crew suffer and die would be an insult to her memory. They were Cas's responsibility now. He stared at the weapon in his hands. He needed to do right by her, if for no other reason than to assuage his own conscience. "Okay, then," he said, staring into the darkness. "Let's find a way to make things better." 32. Dagnya drew in a sharp breath and jolted off the stone slab, all the muscles in her body tensed. The main entrance had been choked off by massive blocks of rock, and blast patterns littered the walls and stone panels. Rockround stood off to the side, tapping one of the glowing stone tablets. He glanced up, nodded to her, then returned to his work. "That was faster than I expected. I'll be with you in a minute." Dagnya's eyes found the dark spot of blood on the floor where she'd bled out. Or she thought she had. After the human had shot her, she'd lost all control for a moment, and she had reasserted herself. And to her horror, in what she had thought were her last moments, Dagnya was afraid of Evelyn and her control. She was much stronger than she should have been. She shook her head. "No. That was nothing more than me being caught off guard." But she couldn't be sure that was the truth. For a brief moment, the human had emerged, had observed what was happening around her, if only for a few seconds, before they lost consciousness. Dagnya gritted her teeth. There was no they. There was only her. As far as she was concerned, the human was dead and buried in the back of her mind somewhere. So then, where was all this fear and anxiety coming from? Athru didn't have these sensations, at least not according to Rockron. "Dagnya, what is going on?" Rockron said, turning from his panel. "Nothing. I was experiencing some dissonance due to my injury." She felt her chest where the projectile had entered. Though the clothing was still wet with blood, there was no longer a hole. The skin had been repaired. "It nearly penetrated the human heart," Rockron said, noticing her movement. "But your athru genes kept you alive long enough for me to repair it. Our bodies are much more resilient than theirs, and yours has some of that redundancy built in. Good thing, too." Dagnya glanced to the main door. "What about them? Are we going after them?" "Of course. But I needed to make sure you were stabilized first. Now that you're up and moving again, we can begin pursuit." "How? The entrance has been blocked." The stones were very huge, and she couldn't even imagine how heavy. "There is more than one way out of this room," he replied, indicating she follow him to the adjacent collection room. As they passed the row of skulls again, she felt a tug deep within, something aching and desperate to get out. "No. You will never see light again." "Your lack of control is disconcerting," Rockron said. "The human should not be bothering you." "It was a traumatic experience. Give me a few moments to collect myself, and I will be fine," she snapped. She was tired of being questioned by him. All of this was under control, and she didn't like him monitoring her and reaching into where he didn't belong. It was a violation of her thoughts. "It is necessary, as you obviously cannot control yourself. Once you've proved to me you are strong enough to keep the human part of yourself suppressed, then I will leave you." He crossed the room to the far wall, standing to the side. Dagnya seethed. No one told her she couldn't control herself. No one had that right. She didn't care if they were athru, human, or something else entirely. She clenched her fists.
"What are you doing?"
Rockron asked.
"Don't you know? You're monitoring me. I just saved you. Perhaps I didn't explain this properly, but athru do not fight amongst ourselves. Our people are past that."
He stared at her intently.
"Then get out of my head," she replied. "I will not be spied upon."
He shook his head.
"Not until you have her under control. Even now, she's influencing your thoughts. She is not." "Come," he said. "Once we kill the humans, you will feel better. More like yourself."
He placed his hand on the stone, and a blue doorway glowed before melting away. On the other side stood a young woman with black hair, her back to them. As the door disappeared, she turned, and her eyes lit up, her face breaking into a huge grin.
"Evie!"
Dagnya recognized her from Evelyn's memories as Laura Yamashita, her partner. Laura stepped into the room, her eyes on nothing else but Dagnya. Rockron grabbed her by the throat, and immediately her confused eyes fell on him.
"It seems we missed one,"
Rockron said, squeezing. Laura tried gasping, but her windpipe had been cut off. Her eyes shot back to Dagnya, pleading. Something deep within Dagnya roared and tore at her consciousness, as if she was nothing more than a paper doll that was being ripped away. Evelyn's desire was overpowering, and Dagnya could barely contain her. She fought to push Evelyn back down, but found she couldn't. The harder she pushed, the harder Evelyn fought back. In her mind's eye, she saw the small woman appear at the edge of an endless cliff, having climbed her way back up. She was smaller than Dagnya, but more determined and angrier. Dagnya stepped back as Evelyn charged her, screaming human obscenities. She put her hands up to defend herself, but when the human smashed into her, it was like she was shattered into 1,000 pieces. She no longer had substance. She'd become less than before, a being without form, only memory, and she was more afraid than ever. Evie blinked over and over, shaking her head, making sure what she thought was real was real. Before her stood the alien known as Rockron, squeezing Laura by the neck. Laura had begun to turn blue, and her eyes hadn't left Evie's. Despite everything that had happened, she couldn't take a moment to process it. She had to save her. Evie glanced around for a weapon as she noticed Rockron's attention turned to her. He knew. Laura reached toward her, and Evie saw the strap across her chest. She had the sword. Rockron's eyes went large, and his grip faltered, releasing Laura as he lunged for Evie. He meant to kill her. Evie knew this in her core, as much as she knew he could sense her thoughts. The other had gone, and he wasn't going to let Evie survive without her. Laura fell to the floor, coughing, but managed to unhook the sword, even though she had to be in considerable pain. She glanced up, then tossed the sword in a high arc over Rockron to Evie, who caught it with one hand. In one fluid motion, she unsheathed it and sliced across Rockron's chest, exposing a red line of blood. For his part, the alien only stumbled back once, but then righted himself and continued toward her, fast. Evie bent and sliced again, this time catching him across the knees as he approached, and his swipe of a hand missed her entirely, and he fell to the ground, howling in pain. Evie turned and held the sword out in front of her again, its blade red with blood. She was now between him and Laura. There was no way he was getting past her. With some difficulty, Rockron stood on wobbly legs. Blood poured from both his knees, but he remained determined. Evie had a millisecond to think. If he could repair a bullet to the chest, he could repair knees with no problem. But she wasn't going to give him that chance. She charged him, feigning a swipe left. When he moved to block it, she drove the sword right into the center of his chest. It slid through with no resistance, and she quickly pulled it back out, almost before he'd had a chance to realize what had happened. His eyes went wide when he felt the wound, and while he was distracted, Evie sliced the sword horizontally through the middle of his face, just below his eyes. Rockron was still for one moment before the top half of his skull and face slid off, exposing the bottom of his elongated brain. The cut had been clean and perfect, and the lifeless body of the athru fell to the ground, blood pouring from all the wounds. Evie took a breath. "Holy shit," Laura said. Evie ran back to her, dropping the sword and inspecting her throat. "Are you okay? What hurts?" "My pride at seeing you slice that thing in half." Laura smiled. "How did you do that?" Evie didn't bother answering. A red mark had already formed where Rockron had squeezed Laura's throat. She'd be bruised for sure. "Can you breathe? Are you okay?" Laura nodded. "I think so," she rasped. "I can still breathe. What happened?" She was looking at the blood on Evie's uniform. "I'm not exactly sure," she replied. "One minute I was me, then I wasn't. Something else took over. Something else he put in me. Like mind control?" Evie thought back to the creature she'd seen in her mind. Had it been mind control? Or something else? She had felt like there was someone else occupying her mind. It hadn't been her doing all those things. But she still saw and experienced what was happening. She still had the memories of what the other had seen. "Oh my God." She slumped to the floor in front of Laura. "What? What's wrong?" "I tried to kill them. Cas and the others. They came for me, and I tried to kill them. Cas shot me." She felt underneath the uniform where the bullet had gone in. But there was no wound. "He what?" "And then Rockron healed me. I don't know how." She glanced over to the unmoving form on the ground. "He wanted me to help him." "Help him what?" Laura croaked. "Kill everyone. All the humans. And then rejoin the others." Laura coughed again, spitting to the side. Evie noticed there was no blood. Good. Wait, she said, her voice a little stronger. "Go back. You tried to kill Cas, and he shot you?" "I don't think he meant to," she replied. "He was defending himself in box. I did a number on them. I was trying to kill them." Her face contorted. "Why?" "That's what the other wanted. It's what all the athru want. They want to exterminate humanity. And I think they're behind the bear things. He said something about controlling them." Laura took Evie's hand. "That wasn't you. You'd never do that to people you cared about." "I almost did," Evie replied, tears welling in her eyes. She felt the tug of something at the back of her mind, something wicked and diseased. "And I think she's still there." "But you regained control," Laura said. "You fought it. And now you're here, with me." Evie smiled, squeezing Laura's hand. "I'm not sure I would have made it out if you hadn't shown up. She was strong." Laura scoffed. "Yeah, well, I don't know too many people who can cut through solid bone without so much as a hesitation." She pointed to the alien. "That was impressive." "Oh, that's the other thing," Evie tested, unsure. "It turns out I'm not completely human. I have certain enhancements." Laura arched an eyebrow, then laughed before it became a coughing fit. She stared at Evie a moment, then launched herself into her arms, peppering her face with kisses. "I'm just so glad you're okay," she said when she took a breath. "When I found your sword—" Evie held Laura tight against herself. She didn't want to think about how close she'd come to death multiple times. Something brushed against the top of her hand. She pulled back, as if seeing Laura for the first time. "Your hair is longer," she said. "How—" "It's a lot to explain," Laura said, releasing her and standing. "Come on. We need to get out of here. We can talk as we go." Evie wasn't about to argue. 33. Are you sure this is the right way? Cas asked, glancing at all four walls of the tunnel. Of course. You told me to make a map, didn't you? Box replied, walking beside him. I didn't think you'd do it. Half the time I figure you're not even listening to what I say. They'd been walking in the dark corridors for at least 10 minutes, but it felt like they hadn't moved at all. Everything looked the same. Still, Cas was feeling a little better. Maybe if he found a way to get the crew out of here, he wouldn't feel so guilty about Evie. I listen, Box whined. You feel bad because you've left me to fend for myself down in sickbay while you get to do all the cool stuff on the bridge. You're experiencing partner abandonment. I'm not going to believe that's a real thing until someone else says it. It's real, Box shouted. As real as any other mental affliction. Here, I'll read you the description. When one partner abandons the other in favor of selfish goals, or if said partner decides to put the needs of others ahead of his original partner, it is not uncommon for them to develop partner abandonment syndrome. Excessive guilt from this condition can cause the original perpetrator extreme and permanent emotional distress. Cas rolled his eyes. He was feeling guilt all right, but not from that. Is that your way of telling me you're lonely? It's not me who has the problem here, Box replied. I'm perfectly balanced. It's you who is suffering from the disease. I suggest some prolonged tests in sickbay. Cas almost laughed. Right. How are your arms? Operating at 46% and dropping. I'll need repairs soon. Cas shone his light all around the corridor. Nothing but stone blocks as far as they could see. If we can just find the others in this control room, we might be able to make that happen. We definitely haven't been this way? No. And if the structure is built the way you say it is, we should be approaching the center of the square portion. If my calculations are correct. I've been measuring not only the length of each hallway, but also its size in comparison to the pyramid outside, creating a three-dimensional interactive map in my mind. This place isn't as confusing as it seems. It is only meant to appear that way. But to someone with a superior tracking system and mental capacity, so you're saying we're close, right? Very close. But don't try to get out of your medical diagnosis. However, if you'd like to broach another subject, I couldn't help but notice something between you and Captain Jan. So you've mentioned, Cas grumbled. But rather than go into the details of that relationship, I'll offer you some free advice. Have you ever noticed how bad you are at interpersonal relationships? What? I am not. What are you? Before, when it was just the two of us, I had a limited amount of information. I thought maybe all the net dramas had it wrong. That in the real world, everyone acted as you did when they were attracted to someone. But now that I've had much more experience, I see my frame of reference was much too small. I thought everyone was terrible at them, because you are terrible at them. He shrugged. Cas sighed. He wished this tunnel was a lot shorter. See, your willingness to accept it only confirms my findings. Your problem is, you never initiate. You always wait for someone else to do it for you. Unless you're paying for it, of course, in which case you don't even have to do anything but lie there. Box. It's pretty easy that way, isn't it? If you don't take the first step, you don't risk getting hurt. Cas cleared his throat. I really don't think this is the time. Furthermore, your lack of initiative makes your future partners confused. They aren't sure if you are attracted to them or not, and thus are left in a state of limbo. Again, selfish behavior on your part. Cas stared at the robot, exasperated. What does this have to do with anything? Why are we even talking about this? I thought you could use some pointers. After all, how long has it been? Cas shook his head and shoved a finger at Box. I know what this is. You're not interested in pointers. You just want me to find someone to shack up with so you can sit there and observe for your little project. Well, guess what? No dice. You're going to have to make do with all that media you downloaded, because there is no way, if I recall, I'm the only one with a map out of here. Cas stopped. Yeah? And if I recall, I'm the one with a gun. I can always build you a new body. All I need to take out of here is your head, and it can function perfectly fine without your body. As Box considered it, Cas cocked his head toward a noise further down the corridor. He pulled his boom cannon from its holster, switching it to projectile, and feeling a pang in his chest as he did so. The noise had come from behind them. Had the alien finally decided to pursue them? After waiting for what? Not that it mattered. Cas was going to finish this. For Evie. Get behind me. Go find the others, Cas said. I wonder if it will be susceptible to doxytroban. One of Box's fingers opened to reveal a needle. What is doxytroban? Cas asked, still pointing his weapon down the empty corridor. A mild narcotic. Zax likes to use it for unruly patients. It's supposed to have a calming effect on humans. But on everyone else, I don't know. Cas's nostrils flared. You couldn't have used that back there? On Evie? I tried, Box protested. You saw how fast she was. I couldn't get an arm in edgewise without her knocking it away. Cas's flashlight caught the glint of something metal in the distance. He held his finger on the trigger. Get ready, he said. Two forms emerged from the shadows. For a second, Cas's brain misfired, and he thought he saw Evie and Laura. But it had to be a trick. He gripped the boom cannon harder. Identify yourselves, he yelled. Boss? Box whispered behind him. I think it's... No, Cas shouted. It can't be, because I shot her. It's an illusion, or a trick, or something else. But whatever it is, it's not her. He turned to Laura. Lieutenant, get away from her, right now. That's an order. Cas, the form of Evie said, causing him to drop his guard upon hearing her voice. It's okay. It's me. That's not possible, he replied. And he could feel more tears welling in his eyes. He blinked them away. He couldn't afford to get distracted, either by emotions or what he thought he saw. It is. The alien repaired me, she replied. Yeah, you two are real buddy-buddy now, aren't you? She held her unsheathed sword in her hand, a sword that could have only been given to her by Laura. Had the alien done the same thing to her? Turned her into a mindless monster bent on destroying them? Cas, listen to me. That wasn't me fighting against you. There's something else inside. I don't quite know how to explain it. She's telling the truth, Laura replied. She already killed the alien. Cas didn't loosen his grip. What if it was a trick? What if it was some alien technology that was just using her body? But I shot you. You died. He spotted the bloodstain on her uniform. It turns out I'm not exactly human, she said. She sheathed the sword, placing her hands up. Please, we may not have a lot of time. Box leaned in behind him. If you feel guilty about shooting her once, think about how bad you'd feel about doing it a second time. Cas dropped the gun, half expecting to be cut to ribbons with her sword. But she just stood there with her arms still raised. It's really you? You survived? She stepped forward, her hand still up. You didn't shoot me. You shot the other, the thing inhabiting me. And yes, I survived. My unique physiology helped with that. He shook his head. I don't know if I can believe it. She took another step forward. I don't think there's anything I can do to prove it to you. Because she had access to all my memories, and vice versa. There is no test that you can give me that she couldn't have passed. You have to be willing to trust me, even if it means putting your life on the line. He searched her eyes. There was nothing there that he hadn't seen 100 times before. Then again, she hadn't looked any different back in that chamber either. But she had been different, speaking in that strange language, murder in her eyes. he no longer saw that same intent. Again, his gaze fell to the bloom of crimson on her uniform. He holstered his weapon.
Thank you.
She walked closer, and Cas grimaced, pulling back before she wrapped him in a hug.
Are you okay? I'm sorry for all of it.
I'm fine. Cas hugged her back. He's emotionally traumatized, Bach said. My diagnosis is it will affect his sexual performance for the rest of his life.
Box,
Evie chided, letting go of Cas and wrapping her arms around Bach's next.
I didn't mean any of it. I was so afraid I permanently damaged you.
From the way his one eye blinked, Cas could tell Box was as surprised as he was. Damaged, yes. Permanently, no. Nothing this knucklehead can't fix. She pulled away from him.
Good. I am so sorry. To both of you. Where are the others?
Cas threw a thumb back behind him. They went on to find the control room. Marshall said it had something to do with the dampeners keeping the power off at the ships.
Marshall?
Evie screwed up her face.
How does he know about the control room?
How do you? Cas asked.
Because, like I was telling Laura, when that creature came out of me, it came with a lot of information already programmed in. Somehow I know how to get around this place, kind of like I knew how to avoid all those mines back at Omicron Terminus.
Then what are we waiting for? Laura asked. Wait, Cas said. This thing that was inside you, is it gone? Evie furrowed her brow.
I don't think so. She's still there. But she doesn't have as much power as she did before. I think Rockron was feeding her somehow, making her stronger. Strong enough to come out on her own. Now she just feels like an old memory, but alive somewhere in the back of my mind.
And what happens if she tries to reassert herself? Cas asked.
Then you'll have to make sure she doesn't get free. The athru are obsessed with killing the entire human race. If she comes back, her goals will be no different than theirs.
I'm not sure I can do that, Cas replied.
When the time comes, Evie said, you may not have a choice.
34. All this new knowledge in Evie's head, frustratingly enough, didn't seem to be available at her leisure. When she was confronted with an experience that needed more information, such as the correct way through a labyrinth, the path would appear to her. But once she was done, it would disappear just as fast, like the outgoing tide. Whatever was in her head was keeping its secrets close to the chest. She led the four of them through the winding maze of corridors in the opposite direction Box had been traveling, much to his protestations. Cas had been right. She could feel the others searching for the control room, if they hadn't already found it. She somehow knew the room she'd been in with Rockron had been some kind of medical facility. Perhaps what the athru used as a sick bay? But now they were headed for their bridge, and everything it controlled, and she knew that included the dampening field, as well as the bear things. He had called them the Carnivax. Fitting name. According to my information, this is not the correct way, Box said.
This place is designed to confuse, Evie replied. It's not meant to be logical or easy to navigate.
She turned to Laura.
It was a miracle you found me at all. That was just luck. I'd run into what I thought was a dead end, but I've been marking each turn I took, so I knew I wasn't going in circles.
Clever, Evie said, smiling. She still couldn't believe Laura had been on this planet over 10 weeks in a matter of hours. If they did manage to regain power, they had a pressing problem. It wasn't as if they could spend decades down on the planet waiting for the ship up above to be repaired. According to Laura, 1 hour in space was an equivalent to 700 down here. Which meant, if it took 4 weeks to repair the ship, they'd have to spend over 40 years on the planet.
Here, it's this way.
She turned left and then right again, coming to a dead end.
Damn, Laura said. Maybe you remembered wrong.
Evie placed her hand on the wall, and an archway glowed blue, before melting away to reveal a large room within.
Nope. Just need a key is all, she replied.
How did you do that? Cas asked.
I think this place is built to respond to the genetic information in the athru. Since I have some of that in me, it responds, she replied. Even though she hadn't quite come to terms with the idea she wasn't completely human, it didn't repulse her. Though, had she been given a choice, she would have preferred a less murderous race of beings to share a heritage with. If you're part alien, why did that never show up on your medical scans? Box asked as they entered the room. I wish I could answer that question. Maybe if we get back, Zax can... Stop! Evie looked up to see Saturina Jan holding a pulse rifle right in her face, with Marshall standing behind her. She was getting used to having guns in her face today. Saturina, hang on. It's me, she said. Nope, the Space Wing pilot replied. I'm not about to fall for that trap. Cas stepped in front of Evie, placing himself between her and the weapon, his hands out. It's okay. I thought the same thing, too. It's her. Trust me. Jan's eyes went from him to Evie to Laura and back again. But I saw you shoot her, right through the chest. She was... Dead, I know. The alien healed her. Jan grimaced. Are you sure? She hasn't invaded your mind or something? I don't think she would have left us alive. That other her was hell-bent on killing us. Jan relaxed her grip. What about the creature? Dead. Laura beamed with pride, with one clean slice to the head. How did you get in here? Jan lowered the weapon. Marshall, he did something with his hand, and the door sort of melted. Like we saw back on that ship. She turned to Cas for confirmation. Wait. Does that mean he's... I'm not one of them. Marshall looked out from behind Jan, but his full attention was on Evie. It shouldn't be possible. What? That I'm alive? Whatever medical technology these people have, it's advanced. At least as advanced as ours. More so, as I wasn't down but for a few minutes. Marshall shook his head. No, that you're, you. Once the other entity took over, you shouldn't have been able to come back. Okay, that's it, Cas said, stepping forward. We've got the captain. Now I want some goddamn answers. Who the hell are you? Is that really our biggest concern right now? Laura asked, pushing past Marshall and Jan to get to the control panel. He's not a threat. Otherwise he would have killed Jan while he was alone with her. She turned to Jan. No offense. Jan worked her jaw. None taken. But we know next to nothing about where we are, Laura continued. We need to disable the field, destroy this place, and get out of here before some trap door opens up and we fall into a pit of spikes or something. Marshall turned to her. You can't just destroy it. You need to shut things down one at a time, or the system will lock and the field will stay active. It's a fail-safe device. Do you mind guarding the one door we do know about? Cas asked Jan. She shot another look at Evie, then nodded. It's good to have you back, she said, passing Evie on her way to the door. Evie smiled, but she still wasn't sure she felt like she was completely back. She certainly didn't feel like she belonged here, not after what she'd endured. Was she even still worthy of being captain? Or should Cas take over? Maybe she didn't even belong back on Tempest. Not with this thing still inside her. Show me what to do, Laura said, staring at the glowing stone tablets before her. Box approached them as well, studying the images and keeping uncharacteristically quiet. It's a sequence, Marshall explained. I was just about to begin. Here, we start with this one. Cas sidled up beside Evie, watching them work. How are you feeling? She stared straight ahead. Like an imposter in someone else's skin. He chuckled. Funny enough, I know just what that feels like. Maybe you'll feel better once we get back on the ship. I'm not sure I should go back, she replied. If that thing inside me comes back, I don't want to go off on the crew. I could kill all of them. He cut his eyes toward the ground. You don't think you can control it? She shook her head. Well, it may not matter anyway. Without a working ship, I don't see how we'd be leaving anyway. This planet might just be our new home. The idea made her sick to her stomach. She didn't want to stay on this planet any more than she wanted that thing to come back.
She couldn't imagine only a few weeks passing in the rest of the universe, while the rest of them lived and died in this strange world, their days stretched out over long periods. It might just drive her crazier than she already felt. "What's this?" Box asked, as Marshall and Laura worked the controls. He pointed to a bright blue set of runes. "That's the temporal actuator," Marshall said. "But don't... You mean the thing that's making time go so slowly here?" Box spun on Cas and Evie, his eye blinking wildly. "I found it!" He turned back to the controls. "And you are off. Problem solved." "No, wait!" Marshall yelled, as Box tapped the buttons. The part of the tablet he was working on went dark. "Shit!" "What is it?" Cas asked. "Nothing. It's too late now. Let's just get this thing shut down as fast as possible." He returned to Laura and hurried his work. "That one there, and this one next," he instructed, pointing out different images to tap and turn. "Hold that one down while I complete this sequence here." Evie stepped forward. "Marshall, what is it? What happened?" "Without the temporal actuator, this planet loses its grip on time. The whole reason these structures exist are to balance the space-time continuum on this planet." "Can't you turn it back on?" Cas asked. "Not without taking very precise measurements. I don't have time to explain it right now." He continued to help Laura shut down the various systems. "Guys, we might have company," Jan yelled from across the room. "I'm hearing something down here, and it doesn't sound pleasant." "It doesn't sound like scuttling, does it?" Cas asked. "They'll have sensed it," Marshall said. "We have to hurry." He turned to Evie. "You can probably sense it as well." "What do you mean, they? Who is they?" "I thought Evie killed the alien," Cas asked. "She did," Laura replied, looking up. "I don't care what kind of technology they have. No one comes back from something like that. His brain was in 2 pieces. Evie furrowed her brow, not sure what Marshall was talking about. Until she did. Deep in her mind, she could feel something in the air had changed, something fundamental. And now that she was reaching out with her mind, she could feel other things as well. Jan was right. Someone was approaching, and it was too small to be a Carnivac. But then she felt a tiny tug in her mind, like 2 magnets pulling toward each other, and turned back to Marshall. "Wait a second. You are one of them, aren't you?" "What?" Cas asked, whipping around. Evie pointed at Tempest's former bartender. "He's an athru, right down to his core." 35. Marshall had his hands up as Cas trained his weapon on him. "We don't have time for this." This entire time? They'd had a member of the species that was hunting them on board this entire time? "What was it?" Cas asked. "Were you a spy? Was that how they knew how and where to hit us back at Omicron?" "Guys," Jan warned from across the room. "No," Marshall replied. "It wasn't like that. Remember I told you I was there to keep an eye on someone? It was her." He nodded to indicate Evie. "I had to make sure she was okay." "Yeah, I'm not buying it," Cas said. "You could have been feeding them information this entire time, and none of us would have suspected." "That's not what happened," Marshall protested, anger rising in his voice. "Guys!" Cas turned to see the door Jan was guarding melt away, revealing another alien creature, like the one they'd encountered back in the other antechamber. He heard the shink of Evie's sword being drawn, and in an instant she was beside Jan, her legs wide, while she held the sword close to her chest. "You're not touching them," Evie said. "Mach lach! Nu das muss Noah!" the creature replied, and lunged for Jan. Jan fired off a series of shots, while Evie used the blade to deflect the swipes from the creature's long arms. One would have hit Jan for sure, had she not parried it. Cas double-checked his boom cannon was set to the projectile mode before turning away from Marshall and firing 3 shots in quick succession at the creature. One clipped its torso, producing a splash of blood. But the creature didn't stop. Instead, it tried to go for Jan, while Evie continued to fend it off. "Hurry, we have to finish," Marshall said from the console. Cas assumed he and Laura would take care of the final sequences. He glanced over to Box, who had ready the injection in his finger. "Mach!" the creature yelled, and jumped clear over Evie and Jan, breaking into a dead run for the control panel. Cas took aim and shot again, this one connecting in his leg, but the alien only faltered for a moment. Pulses hit his back as Jan continued to lay down suppression fire, but that seemed to do little to stop him. No! Evie ran after him with her sword high in the air. Cas saw where the creature was headed, right for Laura, ignoring Marshall completely. Box jumped into his path, grabbing the alien by the arm and injecting him with the drug, only for the alien to throw him off like a rag doll, and Box hit the wall with a crunch of metal on stone. The distraction had given Evie enough time to catch up with the creature. She brought her sword down right on the alien's shoulder, slicing right through skin, muscle, and bone. The arm landed on the ground with a thump as he howled in pain, then jumped high in the air, attaching himself to the tapering ceiling that led to another skylight. He climbed faster than Cas thought possible until his body blocked out the light for a moment and was gone. Cas holstered his gun, then looked down at the arm on the ground, blood spilling into a pool beneath it. Despite it being gray, he couldn't help but think how much it resembled a human arm. And Evie had just sliced it right off, with one clean blow. "How did you do that?" Cas asked. The amount of force she would have needed must have been immense. Evie was breathing hard, but could only stare at the arm as well. I... Before she could finish, Laura launched herself into Evie's arms, wrapping her in a hug. "Are you okay?" Cas heard Laura whisper. Evie nodded. "Nobody check on the robot. He's fine," Box said from the other side of the room. Cas stowed his weapon and ran over to him, checking his injuries. "Did you inject him?" Cas asked. "My syringe is empty, and I don't see any on the floor, so I'm going to say yes," Box replied as Cas helped him up. "You all owe me. Everyone saw it. Had I not slowed him down, the captain never could have sliced the arm off. I want that in the record." Cas couldn't see any additional damage, but from the way Box stood, there was probably internal work that needed to be repaired. "Lateral spine connections?" Cas asked. "Like you have to ask?" Box retorted, his eye blinking in frustration. Cas could tell he was in pain, despite the robot always insisting he didn't have pain receptors. But Cas knew better, because it was impossible to have pleasure receptors without having the opposite, and his friend was more than willing to enjoy those. He knew the pain he couldn't see on Box's face was very real. Cas turned back to Marshall. "What the hell is going on here?" Marshall was still working to turn off all the equipment. "They know what we're trying to do. They can feel the time actuator deactivate, and they're trying to stop us. Because once our ships have power again, they won't be able to hunt us as easily." "Speaking of which," Laura said, having pulled away from Evie, "how much longer is this going to take?" "This is it," Marshall replied. "We're done. The field should be down, and the ship should regain power." Cas tapped his comm. "Robota Talia. Robota Zax. Anyone come in?" There was no reply. Marshall cleared his throat. "Give it a few minutes. Their systems have to reset." "So how do we keep them from turning it back on again?" Laura asked. "What stops that guy from coming back in here after we leave and trapping us again?" "The solution is simple," Jan replied. "We destroy it, and this place along with it." "You can't do that," Marshall said. "He's wrong. You can," Evie replied. "There's a lot of raw energy that runs through this structure. I can feel it in my blood. All we need to do is overload all the systems, and the unit will take care of the rest." She pushed past Marshall to reach the control panels. "No, you don't understand. You can't do that," he replied. "Without the time actuator—" "What?" Evie challenged. "What will happen if it can't be used anymore?" I'm not sure," Marshall replied. "This is how they managed to create those pockets in time, isn't it? Like the archway at Omicron. And this place, where the sun is up, but on the rest of the planet, it's night." He nodded, averting his eyes. "Tell me the truth, Marshall. Have you been spying on us for them?" He shook his head. "My mission was only to watch you, to make sure you were all right, and to alert my superiors if your abilities began to manifest." "Your superiors?" Evie echoed. "The athru?" "Not exactly," he replied, "but it isn't my place to say. I'll have to make my report first before I can give you more information." Cas charged him, stopping right in front of the man. I don't think so. You're going to tell us everything right now. No more secrets.
Guys, Laura yelled, let him tell us back in the ship. If those things come back... How many are there anyway? Jan asked. Enough, Evie replied.
She had a strange faraway look on her face, like she was seeing into another world. Cas didn't like any of it. She turned to him, her eyes suddenly clear.
I need you to keep a weapon trained on me.
What? No. Why would...
Because if this thing comes back out, she can't be allowed to survive. These athru, they're ruthless. They'll do anything to kill us. And they all have to be stopped.
Her gaze was intense. Evie, I can't do that. The first time was a mistake. I couldn't live with myself if I did that again. Cas hung his head. She turned to Box.
Can you do it? With one of your syringes?
I suppose I could mix Exarodine and a Faradol. It should make a fairly deadly combination, he replied.
Then that's what you are to do, and that's an order.
She winced, stretching her neck out.
She's still there, faint but there, and she's mad.
She turned her attention to the control panel, her hands moving over it in sharp, precise movements. Cas glanced at Laura, who was staring back at him, her eyes pleading with him. While Evie worked, he motioned for Box to follow him out of her hearing range.
Don't do it, Cas whispered.
I'm not, he replied. You need to have a little more faith in your favorite doctor. Just because I've been in the wilderness for a season doesn't mean I've gone stupid. But I can give her something that should knock her out. Cas gave him a knowing look. Just so long as we're all on the same page.
That's it, Evie said. At least I think that's it. It should feed back on itself, destroying the entire system.
Please, Marshall replied. You do this, and it could have unintended consequences. Laura stepped forward.
Yeah? How about you cut it with the cynical warnings and tell us why we shouldn't just leave you here? We're not leaving anyone, Evie replied, especially not when he seems to know so much. Now we need to go. We don't have long before the system overloads itself.
I know the way, Box said, approaching the wall where the door had appeared, as long as there isn't an army of athru on the other side.
There's not, Evie replied, stepping forward and placing her hand on the wall.
It glowed blue, and the door melted away.
There aren't a lot of them left. Most departed with the Armada. Isn't that right, Marshall?
It's what I assume, he replied, but I don't know it for sure.
Come on,
Jan said, motioning with a rifle.
You're walking ahead of me.
I'll lead the way, Box said. Evie stared up at him.
I'll lead the way. You stay behind me in case we run into any more problems. Let's move.
She trotted out into the dark passageway beyond, her light the only source of illumination in the dark tunnel. Box followed, as did Laura and Cas, with Marshall and Jan bringing up the rear. They wound through the corridors, and within minutes Cas was lost again. But Evie seemed to know exactly which way to go. It was just like back at Omicron. She had said she'd seen a map in her mind, and he could only assume that's what she was seeing here. So, what if she was part alien? Normally, Cas wouldn't have even blinked an eye. There were individuals all over the Coalition and the Sargan Commonwealth who were the product of two different species. Usually it required some inventive genetic engineering to be possible. But it had become quite common in the last 200 to 300 years. The difference with Evie was she was part of them. And Cas had seen the fury in her eyes when she'd been attacking him and Box. He didn't want to question her judgment, but he was also more on edge than he should have been. What if she was right? What if that thing inside her came back, and Box had to knock her out? How would they handle that going forward? He shook his head. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. He needed to focus on the task at hand, getting out of this place and returning to camp. Once they had the shuttles and space wings back up and running, they could worry about everything else. 36.
Something's wrong, Evie said as they exited the pyramid. She couldn't describe it, but there was an unease within her, and something didn't feel quite right. How far back to camp?
According to the information I downloaded from the device you gave to Ensign River, about 6 kilometers, Box replied. Cas tapped his comm again. Does anyone copy? Base Camp 2, do you respond? This won't end well, Marshall muttered behind them. You've disrupted their plan. They won't hesitate now. Evie spun on him.
What was the plan? What were you going to do down here?
You need to understand. You were never supposed to find this planet, Marshall said, his voice gruff. Never in 1,000 years did I ever think we'd ever come here. But here you are, and it was my job to protect you. Before you snuck away, I was planning on bringing a few of the security personnel with me here to shut off the dampener. I figured it had to be here.
And then what? Evie asked. We just go on our merry way?
My hope was to do it without disturbing the native population. But once I realized the time dilation was in effect and Wave 1 had been here for weeks already—
More like a quarter of a year,
Laura said. Then I knew it was too late. After that, it was about containing the damage. I still can't raise anyone, Cas said, walking over. Are you sure the dampener is off? Evie stared up. The planet's star was high in the sky. It had been the star she'd seen inside the pyramid's chamber.
Wait. How long were we in there?
Maybe Rockron had her unconscious longer than she'd realized. Don't worry, Cas replied. This is inside another one of those bubbles. Outside, it's still twilight. Or it was when we went in. I don't think we've been in there for more than an hour or two. 2.35, Box replied.
Then let's get outside this field, Evie replied. Maybe it's still blocking comms.
Her stomach turned again. Something was wrong.
Look,
Laura pointed to the archway when it finally came into view. It seemed like it was a kilometer away. But that might have just been the star beating down on them.
The arch.
Evie glanced up and saw a splash of red on the right side of the archway. It was smeared, but fresh.
Is that?
The blood of the one you mutilated, Marshall replied. He's out there, and there may be others.
Quickly, through the arch, Evie ordered.
They all crossed through. But when she came out on the other side of the jungle, her fears manifested. For one, it was still daylight. And two, the star seemed to be moving across the sky at a rapid rate, though it wasn't setting. For some reason, they were stuck in perpetual daylight now. Oh, that's not good, Marshall said. Rabot to base camp. Someone respond. His comm unit crackled.
Commander?
Zax? Cas drew his hand closer to his face. Can you hear me? What's the situation there?
We've been holed up since we were attacked by this bear-like thing. Then suddenly, it was light outside, she said.
Evie motioned for all of them to begin jogging in the direction of camp. Cas could run and talk at the same time. Anything else? He said, trotting behind the others. Evie pulled back so she could hear.
Zal doesn't have much time left. We're still holed up in the shuttles now. Should we leave and try to restart the engines?
Yes, Cas replied, glancing at Evie. If you have to go out, only send a few people at a time. Those bear things may not be the only things out there. We're at least 30 minutes from your position.
Understood. We'll do what we can until you arrive.
Cas cut the comm.
The alien computer should have self-destructed by now,
Evie said. Glancing back to the arch, they could no longer see due to the underbrush. I'm sure you took care of it. What were you expecting? An explosion? He had a grin plastered on his face. She returned the gesture. It felt good to smile again.
I guess not.
She was relieved Zax and the others were still alive. She'd been afraid the Carnivacs would come and try to destroy the camp, but fortunately that hadn't happened. So then, why did she still feel that pit in the bottom of her stomach?
Hey, keep up,
Jan yelled behind them, forcing Marshall forward. He was lagging behind. He ran up beside Evie as Box hopped over a fallen log, prompting everyone else to crawl under it or go around it. I know this isn't what you want to hear, Marshall said, but there was no way you could have ever known about me. They altered my genetic code, and they made me appear human enough to fool anything the Coalition had. The funny thing was, I didn't start keeping an eye on you until you left Sisk.
You know about Sisk? Evie asked.
I know a lot. I got lucky on Tempest. They needed me to fill a role. But when you were on the Saragossa, I had to rely on comms back and forth from a contact of mine. And And when you were in the academy, I couldn't get too close."
"You were there too?" Evie asked,
as Bach slowed ahead of them to push through some thick brush. He nodded. "I did my best to blend into the background."
"You're right. I don't want to hear it."
The fact he was part of the athru in whatever way was secondary. She was more upset she'd had someone trailing her most of her life, and she'd never realized. She'd never suspected. Green had never suspected. Hadn't there been background checks? Records? All of which was stored in the Coalition's database. Those files couldn't be altered. Unless...
"You had someone on the inside."
She shook her head.
"Someone willing to alter official Coalition records to give you a past."
"It wasn't quite that simple," he replied. "And don't treat me like I'm the bad person here. I was following orders, just like you were."
"Orders from whom?"
she asked. He only shook his head. When she got back to the shuttles, she was going to do a very thorough search through the records for his background information. Even if they were fake, they might lead to something. She wasn't about to let this go, no matter how little he wanted to reveal. She'd find out the truth one way or another. But for the time being, she just wanted to get back to her crew. Zax turned away from the comm, glad to feel some circulation of air. The power in the shuttle had reinitialized less than 10 minutes before the commander had called, which had been the relief they'd all needed. Her plan to confuse the bear things with her scent had worked for a while, and she'd managed to get all of the security crew back into the second shuttle, sealing them all inside. But every time she peeked out to check the situation, the creatures were out there, still patrolling the camp. As far as she could tell, they hadn't sat down to rest or even paused in their search. And from the way their long black tongues hung from their mouths, they appeared overweary. And yet they wouldn't stop. She was afraid they might exhaust themselves to death. But when it had suddenly become daylight, and she looked again, they were gone, their large tracks leading off into the woods. She'd been hesitant to exit in case it was a trap. But without any air circulation, the shuttles were getting stuffy. Not to mention, she feared the worst for Zal. But as soon as the power had come back on, and she'd been able to talk to the other shuttle, she'd been relieved to find him still among the living. Somehow, he'd hung on.
"So, what's the play?" Ensign Talia asked from behind her. "I'm going out there. I need to check on the other shuttle. Caspian said to get the engines up and running. They're on their way." "Shouldn't be too much trouble now the power is back on," she replied. "You go check. I'll try to reach the Tempest. But this time thing might make that difficult."
"Good luck," Zax said, opening the shuttle door. She checked all around the opening, and finding nothing threatening, hopped out and trotted over to her shuttle, where she'd left the rest of the crew. She tapped on the door, and one of the engineers slid the door open just a crack.
"Oh, Doctor," he said. "Crewman, gather a small engineering team. We need to make preparations to leave."
"We're leaving?" he asked. "But what about the ship's limited resources?"
"Not my call," Zax replied. "Those orders came straight from our first officer."
"Yes, ma'am," he replied, nodding to a few of the others sitting on crates in the cargo area. "Fleming, Norris, you're with me." The two men nodded and followed him outside. "I'll report back once we've gone over the checklist of each shuttle."
"Very good,"
Zax said, barely listening. Her focus was on Zal. She weaved through the shuttle's cargo area into the sleeping quarters, where most of the bunks were taken up by other members of the crew. She bent down to Zal's bunk. His exoskeleton was completely still, but the medical monitor she'd installed above his head still indicated activity from the person within.
"Don't worry. We're headed back to Tempest soon. And I'll put you in stasis before I bring you back to this planet again, if that's what we end up doing."
There was a small spike in activity on Zal's monitor, but the exoskeleton still didn't respond. It must have completely corroded or otherwise shut down. Zax stood, checking with the rest of the crew. Some of them had fevers. Despite having cleared this planet, it still wasn't unheard of for teams who went down to planets to catch non-lethal bugs. She'd have to give an immunoboost to the entire crew. And now that there was no longer a concern of her supplies running out of coolant, she could begin immediately. Zax returned to the cargo area and found the storage containers, opening the first one, which included a general immune booster in addition to a microscanner. Both could be administered at the same time. And while destroying any foreign objects in the system, the scanner would also search for any unknowns. Just as she turned to head back, 2 hands full of the boosters, there came a high-pitched scream from outside. Zax dropped the vials and ran. 37. I'm picking up, something. Cas chanced to look at Box as they trotted, which turned out to be a mistake, because the moment he took his eyes off what was in front of him, he tripped on an errant branch and fell face first into the dirt. The rest of their party slowed behind them. Oh, sorry, boss. Cas stared up into Box's good eye, pushing himself up off the ground with a grunt. Don't offer to help or anything. I'm fine. Box pointed to his bandaged arms, which had turned black from all the fluid leaking into them. If you haven't noticed, I am injured. Are you saying I should risk further injury to assist you? No, Cas grumbled, dusting himself off and not bothering to turn around. He was too embarrassed to face the others. Come on, Laura said, pushing past him. Let's not linger. If there's one rule about this place, it's you don't stay in a single spot for long. There's still the matter of what I heard, Box said, holding up a single finger, as if he was holding everyone for a presentation. Which was? Cas said. He couldn't help but catch Evie's eye. And though he knew she saw him right back, her face was blank, like she was staring off into space. It was so disconcerting, Cas almost shuddered. A scream! Oh, wait, there's another one. They came from the direction of the camp. Evie's eye snapped into focus just as Cas realized what Box was saying. Shit! Without hesitation, he took off in the same direction they'd been heading, Box trotting to catch up. Had more of those bear things infiltrated? Or was it the athru? There were obviously more than just a few in the vicinity. They needed to reach the camp immediately. Just as he began to recognize the foliage, Cas heard the first scream himself. He vaulted over limbs, rocks, and anything else in his way, his only focus on getting to their people. He wasn't sure if anyone else had kept up, as everything around him had fallen away. Even the burning in his legs seemed secondary. All he knew was he couldn't stop. The sounds of weapons fire permeated the air, just as Cas broke through the underbrush. It was the first time he'd seen the camp in full daylight, and it took his senses a second to make the adjustment. Box and Evie appeared on either side of him. By Cor, Evie whispered. Bodies of their fellow crewmates lay strewn across the open space, blood coloring almost every surface. 3 athru, each in different parts of the camp, faced down groups of the remaining crew with pulse rifles. Just as before, the athru took the hits from the crew's pulse rifles and kept on coming. None of them noticed Cas and the others. Cas yanked his boom cannon from its holster, making sure it was set to fire projectiles. We have to stop them, no matter the cost. No matter the cost, Evie repeated. Cas glanced behind him at Jan, who had her rifle unslung and ready, and then to Laura, who was baring her teeth like a wild animal, ready to pounce. Marshall seemed to be the only one unsteady about entering the fray. Cas tore into the arena, the boom cannon outstretched in front of him, and fired at the closest athru. It was missing its arm. Cas had to assume it was the same one from the pyramid. The first projectile hit it in the back, and it turned to Cas, its dark eyes narrowed and angry. Nurse Riley, who'd been trying to keep it off him, fell back as the athru squared up against Cas. He fired the boom cannon again, but the athru dodged, leaping high into the air and landing on top of the nearest shuttle. Pulse weapons are ineffective against them, he heard Jan call out. But he didn't dare take his attention off the one in front of him. These aliens were too fast, and he'd underestimated them once before. It wasn't something he planned to repeat. He could almost sense the hatred radiating off the athru, and as they remained in their respective positions, their gazes locked on each other, Cas couldn't help but listen to the sounds of carnage all around him. If only he had a distraction to give him an edge. Whatever your reasons for doing this, I'm not going to let you kill my crew, Cas said. Tal der lech, as mach de mach, the creature snarled. Cas jerked his head to the side, keeping his eyes on the athru. Yeah, I don't know what that means. What I do know is your plan for my friend didn't go exactly as you hoped. She beat whatever you put inside her. The athru's eyes flashed, and for a brief second it altered its gaze. That was all it took. Just as the athru realized its mistake, Cas pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the alien's front lobe, leaving a decent hole. His body tensed for a second before toppling off the top of the shuttle. One down, Cas said to himself. He turned, searching for his next target. Box had latched onto one of the aliens and was attempting to keep it restrained. Yet the athru wasn't fighting back, despite the fact it had an easy hit to Box's faceplate. It only seemed interested in breaking free to attack the others. Strangely, the other alien also seemed to be attempting to fight past Evie and Marshall, who fended it off as it tried to reach Laura, Jan, and the others headed for the shuttles. Evie blocked and parried with expert precision, while Marshall used nothing but his fists. Box turned to Cas, the alien struggling in his grasp. "What do you want me to do with this one?" he yelled. As he did, Cas saw one of the jacket sleeves Cas had wrapped around Box's arm come undone, and more fluid leak from Box's arm. The makeshift bandage lost what little tension it still had and fell to Box's side, useless. Without both arms holding him, the athru slipped from Box's grip and sprinted away, circling around the far side of the camp. "Oh," Box said, watching him go. "Never mind. Give me a hand?" Cas ignored him. Obviously, Box wasn't a target. The athru seemed to only be going after humans, which only further confirmed Evie and Marshall weren't all they appeared. He glanced around. The other alien had given up and disappeared back into the woods as well. "Cas, get to the shuttles. We need to get out of here," Evie yelled. Cas scanned the immediate area, then jogged to the center of camp, keeping an eye out for a surprise attack. "When I sent a crew out to start on the engines," Zach said, huffing, the pulse rifle still in her one hand, "they attacked. Took out the engineering crew. When I came outside to see what was going on, I saw them doing something to the engines." "Fuck!" Cas yelled, jogging around to the back of the ship. Sure enough, the athru had torn the outer casings of the engines off and damaged the primary injectors. "Is it like this on all of them?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Zax replied. Cas had a hunch they had disabled any shuttle that was occupied, betting the humans couldn't move to an undamaged shuttle without being slaughtered. And they were probably right. The bastards were fast. And the longer they stayed here, the more likely it was even more would show up. "I'll go check the others," Jan said, trotting away from the group toward the other ships. "There," Evie said, as one of the athru flew out of the woods directly at Jan. Cas pulled his weapon to fire, but before he could get a good shot, Jan had flipped her rifle in her hands and used the butt of it to strike the athru in the face. It blinked as it stumbled back, giving Cas a clear shot, and he fired right at his head. The bullet grazed the alien's cheek, and he turned and ran back into the cover of the woods. "Catch!" Cas yelled, throwing Jan the boom cannon. "It's got a kick, so watch out." She nodded, giving him a grin as she dropped her rifle. Cas returned his attention to the shuttle. The damage wasn't that bad, but would take time to repair. He motioned to Evie. "Can you give me a few minutes?" "As much as we can," Evie replied, scanning the field. Even though it wasn't an ambush, it felt like one. And at the back of her mind, she could feel the others soaking it all up, laughing. She hated that thing was a part of her, and that she was unable to rid herself of it. And then it hit Evie. It seemed like the more she thought about it, the stronger it became. Instead, she focused her thoughts on tactics to repel the athru. Despite having two left, they were as lethal as anything else, and she had to make sure to protect Cas until he could get the shuttles up and running again. She glanced over to Laura, still beside her, with her weapon out, ready to die to destroy these things. "You look like a pro," Evie quipped. "After spending as long in the jungle as I have, you learn what to look for," she replied. "I think I could get used to life back on a planet. At least you never have to worry about the anti-grav failing. Life planet-side is overrated. Give me a ship any day." She continued to scan the jungle. "What are we going to do when we get back up there? How can we stay alive if the ship still isn't functional?" "I don't know," Evie replied. "But we obviously can't stay here. We'll have to figure out something else." As the last word came out of her mouth, Evie caught the blur of something in her peripheral vision. Before she even realized she told herself to do it, her sword had blocked one of the athru's hands from coming down on Laura's face, possibly saving her from disfiguration, or worse, decapitation. He growled as Evie's strength matched his own. Stunned, Laura pulled the trigger for a moment of rapid-fire burst until he fell back. The pulse rifles may not kill them, but they but Evie couldn't imagine their skin was so thick they didn't feel it at all. The athru stumbled back some more, until he fell, holding a stomach. "Amas look, firis rolak, maj esh." The words, though gibberish to her universal-coded mind, found a way to permeate an even older part of her and convey their meaning. "Traitor, you have broken your bond to us. No one is safe." Evie furrowed her brow, holding her sword out in front of her. Her only hope was to get in one good swipe and lop that head right off. But that was easier said than done. At least maybe now they would come after her instead of just targeting Laura and the others. "Did you get that?" Marshall asked a few meters away. "I got it." She stared at the athru. He was more than welcome to take her head on. She championed it. "I want you to go. Get everyone else back on the shuttles," Evie said, not looking at Laura. "You can't take them both at once," Laura replied. "I won't let you." "That's an order," Evie said, not taking her eyes off the athru. The moment she did, Laura was dead. He just stared right back at her, and she could feel the entity within stirring. She'd been right. She was too dangerous to go back with the rest of them, but that didn't mean she couldn't give them a fighting chance. Cas would take over as captain and get them back home. It would all work out. "That's not an order I can follow," Laura replied. "I'm serious. You need to leave. I can't do this with you here." She knew Laura was just being stubborn, wanting to stay for her sake. But Evie loved her too much to let her do that. "You mean you can't do this without me?" Laura replied. "Listen to me," Evie said, still not taking her eyes off the creature. "This has gone too far. Remember what you told me? I have to put a stop to this. This is that hard no. It's over. Return to the shuttles. Get everyone off this planet." She didn't turn to see Laura, but she could sense all the fight go out of her. If this was what it took to get her to safety, then damn the consequences. "You're just saying that to make me leave." There was hurt in her voice, like she couldn't believe Evie had said that. "No, I'm saying that because you're a liability, and they will use you against me. With you gone, I don't have to worry about them hurting you." The creature grinned with its small mouth. It was not an image Evie liked. "And what about you?" Laura asked. Evie could hear the tears in her voice. "What? You're just going to stay here? Forever?" Evie wanted to turn and look her in the eye. She wanted to embrace her and tell her all the things she deserved to hear. But if she did that, she'd be compromised, and the alien would pounce. It knew it couldn't get past Evie as long as all her attention was on it, but she could already tell it was working out a way to get under her defenses. And if she so much as glanced at Laura, Evie knew all her walls would come down, and she wouldn't be any good to anyone. "I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I have no business on Tempest anymore. This is where I belong. Now please, do as I ask. If you truly love me, you'll give me that basic respect." "I do love you," Laura whispered. "But you're wrong." Her voice hitched on the last word. But relief flooded Evie's entire body as she heard her jog away. "You did the right thing," Marshall said. Evie watched as the trees beyond the athru parted, revealing a dozen more gray beings. "I know." 38. This never should have happened. They never should have landed on this planet in the first place. Cas couldn't believe the run of bad luck they'd had ever since leaving Coalition space. And now, here he was, trying to repair a Type 6 shuttle engine with little more than an engineering kit and his bare hands so they could get off this planet. That doesn't go there. Box watched as Cas reconnected the injector assembly to the override capacitors. "I know that. But we're in a pinch, and I don't have the equipment to repair it properly," he replied, wiping the sweat from his brow. He was on his back, less than 15 centimeters from the assembly, trying to work as fast as he could. The last thing he needed was Box's distractions. "Is that what you did with me?" You were in a pinch, so you rewired a few things? Cas groaned. Are you still on that? I don't really think this is the time. Ugh! The spanner in his hand slipped from his grip and smacked him on the head. Damn it! I believe I am owed an explanation, Box replied. I could be an entirely different person. Wouldn't you want to know if someone messed up your circuits? Cas grabbed the spanner again and resumed his work. I didn't, mess up your circuits. I just turned off some of the defaults. He finished securing the injector into place. At the sound of feet running up, he jumped until he recognized Jan's boots.
The other shuttle Zach shoved people in has the same problem, she said. Casing is gone, and the engines are shot. Either we're going to have to move these people, or we need to come up with another plan.
Cas rolled out from under the shuttle and stood, wiping his hands. What's the situation over there? I'm not sure, Box replied. Last I checked, there were still 2 of those things. We have to find a way to take them out, Cas said. These things were tough, and there was no way they could hold their own against more than one. He turned to Jan. What about the space wings? Did you check those? She shook her head.
Too far away. They're on the other side of the clearing, remember?
Still, Cas said, they're the only things we have with weapons that might do some damage to those bastards. We need to get at least one of them up and running. He glanced around. Where are the rest of the crew? Zax was moving them back inside until Evie could take care of the athru, Box replied. But it looks like they might be in there longer than they predicted. Think we can make it? Cas asked. Jan sucked her lips between her teeth, cutting her eyes in that direction.
If there aren't any obstacles, like more of those gray bastards waiting out there for us.
She checked his boom cannon.
There's only 6 shots left.
She held it out for Cas. He shook his head, pushing it back to her. Just make them count, Cas replied. I'm right behind you. Box will provide the distraction. She leaned forward slightly, like she was about to say something, then pulled back again, his weapon in her hand.
Thanks. Good luck.
You too. Cas turned to Box as she jogged off in the direction of the space wings. Time to do what you do best. I need to make sure all their attention isn't on me or Jan. Help Evie. Keep them occupied. You're going to need me, Box said. You can't do this by yourself. Yeah. I need you to be the distraction. He could still see Jan, but she would disappear into the brush soon, and he didn't want to lose sight of her. Just help me out, okay? Dance, monkey, dance, Box announced, turning away. Don't forget to do a few flips and stand on your head for the nice people. Coins only, please. No trash. Cas ignored him. Instead took off after Jan. Box could do this. It just needed to be a few minutes so he could make sure they could get at least one of the ships up and running again. He moved quietly, keeping his head down, until he was out of the main circle of shuttles and into the woods again. Any pain he'd felt after traversing all those kilometers had long left him. He was on nothing but adrenaline now, and he knew there was probably only a 30% chance this would work, but it was worth trying anyway. At this point, what else did they have to lose? He'd lost sight of Jan, but could see daylight streaming through the thick underbrush. He was close. He couldn't believe how much easier it was to run through all this in daylight. It felt like a different planet. Cas broke through the edge of the woods into the open field where the 4 space wings sat. Jan was about 100 meters ahead of him, running at a full sprint to the ships. Cas took off after her, but as he was running, caught the sight of a massive brown form charging her from the right. He tried to yell, but she'd already seen it, and he watched as she froze for a moment, captured by terror at the bear thing. Cas couldn't watch this happen again. He yelled as loud as he could, waving his arms and running straight for them. The bear thing turned its attention from Jan and charged Cas instead. He had nowhere to go. He was in the middle of a field with no cover, and the bear was faster than he could ever hope to be. His one thought was to lead it away from Jan and the space wings. At least he could buy her some time. He took off in the opposite direction, already feeling the ground rumbling from the bear's feet pounding into the dirt behind him. As it ran, it snorted like a racehorse, bearing down on its target. Cas's mind flashed back to the scene at Wave 1's camp, where they'd seen all the blood. He only hoped it would be quick. They came in rapid succession, 4 quick pops in the air. At first he thought maybe his knees had failed him, and the sound had been his kneecaps exploding. But as he found himself still on 2 feet, Cas turned to see the bear charging back toward Jan, its rear red with blood. She had a determined look on her face, holding his boom cannon in front of her as the bear tore across the field with fury. If he'd been anxious to catch up with Cas, he was downright rabid to reach Jan. But she didn't move an inch, instead held the weapon out in front of her as he drew closer and closer. At first, Cas thought she had frozen again, but then he saw the look of determination across her creased brow, and he knew what she was doing. When the bear was right on her, no more than 10 meters away, she let the last 2 bullets fly, and they struck the animal dead center in its head, causing the front of the massive animal to pitch down and flip ass over head. Jan tried to jump to the side, but the bear was too close, and Cas watched in horror as she disappeared underneath the massive animal. "Shit!" he yelled, running over to them. As soon as he was close enough, he could see she'd made a part of the way, as her torso was sticking out from under the huge animal. But she was grunting in pain, her hands pushing against the bloodied fur of its hide. "Hang on, I've got you," Cas said, and ran up beside her, shoving his shoulder into the creature's back. "Legs, they're—" Jan said, panic in her voice. Cas thought it was the first time he'd ever heard her sound panicked. "I know," he replied. He pushed again, and the creature's body rocked, but it wasn't enough. Jan yelled in frustration and pain. "One more time," Cas said, really putting his back into it. 1, 2, 3. He pushed as hard as he could. At the same time, Jan shoved forward, and the bear rolled up. Jan scrambled back as fast as she could, out of range. Cas held the bear a bit longer than necessary to make sure she was clear, then let her drop back. He bent over, hands on his knees, and sucked in air. If he made it to tomorrow, there was no way he was going to be able to move. "Nice shooting." Jan returned a placating smile. "Not nice enough. I think my ankles are broken." Cas's face fell. He glanced to the nearest space wing, with its ladder that led to the cockpit. "Then we have a problem." "No, we don't," she replied. "You're going to fly it. I'll walk you through it." She tapped the comm at the back of her hand. "Secure connection, Rabot." The comm in Cas's hand pinged. "Wait a second," he said, standing back straight. "No way! You of all people know I can't fly. Don't you remember me taking the shuttle and almost killing someone? And you want me to fly what is essentially a weapon?" "We don't have a choice. There's no one else here to do it," she said, gesturing around. "And we don't have time to go back. You're going to have to. Like I said, I'll walk you through it." She scooted herself back across the field, away from the bear. "Here," Cas said, "let me help." He bent down and let her put her arms around his neck. He secured her legs, then lifted up, walking her over to one of the other space wings for cover. "I can't just leave you here." "I'll be fine," she said, her mouth precariously close to his ear. A shiver ran through him, and all of a sudden Cas felt like maybe he could fly a space wing. "As long as you follow my instructions, I can get you through this. Set me down over there." She pointed to Captain C's ship. Cas jogged over to the far side of the ship and set her down behind it, out of sight of the tree line. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his heart hammering at his chest. Was that because he was exhausted? Or something else? "Quit wasting time and get into my ship," she said, pointing. "We don't have time to argue." Cas hesitated one last second, then ran over to Jan's ship, noting her call sign painted on the side as he climbed the ladder. Rings. Captain Saturina Rings Jan. Cas chuckled. She must have really pissed someone off to get that one. He bet it was Raffenkel. He stepped into the cockpit and initiated the startup sequence. The ladder retracted, and the cockpit cover came down and sealed itself all around him. "You in?" Jan asked through the comm. "Yeah," Cas replied, staring at the hundreds of controls in front of him. "Okay then. Let's get you airborne." 39. What were they doing? It was like the athru were testing her, trying to see if she would make the first move. Or maybe there was something else to it. Laura was gone. All the crew was back in the shuttles. There was no one else to attack except for her and Marshall. And if he really was athru, then their hesitation could be more about not wanting to break their own code, despite the head athru's words to her. Did he know what she'd done to Rockron? He'd at least seen her wound the one-armed athru. His blood was still on her blade, a blade which she still held out in front of her. She really wished Cas would hurry up and get those engines working. "Okay, listen up." She didn't jump at Box's voice, but she did take her eyes off the athru in front of her for a split second. And that was all it took. In the millisecond when her gaze shifted to the side, the athru charged her. But she managed to block his attack in just enough time. His hand had been coming straight for her face, and she managed to slice a significant gash across the palm. The athru winced in pain and took a step back, but Evie could already see the other dozen athru closing in. "Oh, shit!" Box yelled, but was cut off. Evie didn't have time to see what happened. Her focus was on keeping as many athru as possible away from the shuttles. A shiver ran through her, and she realized if she focused hard enough, she could match their speed. The thing deep within her howled, angry she'd harnessed some of its power. But Evie had control now and wasn't letting go. In one deft move, she shot forward, slicing right through the athru's chest with a sword, sending blood flying. His eyes went wide with surprise as he fell backward, dead or too wounded to continue fighting. Evie didn't care which. She took stock of the situation. Box was being overwhelmed by two athru. Marshall had one in hand-to-hand combat, which he seemed to be holding for a moment, and the other 9 had run past all of them and focused on breaking into the shuttles, beating on the doors and windows. There was only one way to do this. Evie focused her newfound energy on them, on what they represented. She'd have to be quicker than they were, otherwise none of it would matter. Still, the creature within her screamed for her to stop, to let her out. But Evie wasn't going back there, not after what happened last time. Evie leapt. She barely felt the ground beneath her feet. It was like striding across clouds. In no time, she'd reached the shuttles, and in a series of swipes, removed the athru from its hull. Each cut of the blade was perfect, each slash hitting its mark, while her arms worked without any guidance. It was as if they had a mind of their own. They knew what to do and how, and they were fast, faster than the athru could ever be. And still the entity deep within grew angrier with each athru she cut down. In what seemed like no time at all, 6 athru lay dead at Evie's feet, their blood seeping into the ground. As she turned to face the others, strong arms wrapped around her, holding her back. Evie grunted, pitching her head back until it connected with the athru, at which point he let go, and she turned, sending the sword straight through the athru's chest. A surprised look came over its face, and it fell back, holding the wound after Evie withdrew the sword. It said something in its language, but Evie didn't understand it, and she didn't care to. She was going to do whatever was necessary to protect her crew. In front of her, only 2 more athru remained. She wasn't sure where Marshall, Box, and the others had gone, but she'd deal with them once these were dead. The first one charged her, and with a quick slash of her blade, she disposed of him, his limp body falling to the side in a heap. Finally, the last athru stood before her. He was lanky, but looked strong. The one arm hung limp at its side. The creature inside Evie screamed again, and she wasted no time. She was going to kill every one of these things if she had to. Evie charged him, her sword high above her head, and brought it down, until it stopped as soon as it hit the athru's shoulder. Instead of cutting through the skin, it had hit something hard and clinked, metal on metal. Evie furrowed her brow. That wasn't right. Inside, the creature's fury turned to amusement as it began to laugh. It was an evil sound. And all of a sudden, Evie's world fell away from her, and she was back on the precipice with a monstrous version of herself. "You lose," the creature said, laughing as it morphed into smoke again and wafted away in the imaginary breeze. Evie blinked, returning to reality, only to find Box standing in front of her instead of an athru, a tiny nick on his shoulder where her blade had hit him. "Captain Diazol," he said, slowly and carefully. She didn't like the sound of those words, the way they came out to comfort her. Evie looked down at the sword. It was covered in blood, enough so that it dripped from the edge of the blade. "Captain, are you with me?" Evie looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest and her hand shaking. Yes, I think so." "Don't turn around," Box said, reaching down and taking the sword from her hand. It fell away without resistance. She couldn't help herself. It was as if as soon as he'd said it, she could think of nothing else. Evie turned, only to find unspeakable horror. Marshall lay off to the side, a gushing slash across his chest. He was breathing, but they were ragged and shallow breaths. No, it couldn't be. Evie glanced back to the shuttle, where she'd taken down the athru, but they weren't there. It was only her fellow crewmates who had been trying to get back into the shuttle itself. They hadn't been trying to break in. They'd been trying to get the shuttle ready for takeoff. The creature had fooled her, made her see something that wasn't there, and in turn made Evie slaughter her own crew. She couldn't breathe. At any moment, she was going to lose consciousness from no air. And then she saw her. Lying off to the side, her black hair pooled around her head. Evie saw white spots in her vision, and she fell to the ground, her knees having lost all strength in them. "No," she implored. "Please, God, no." She scrambled up and ran over to Laura's still body, a stain of blood in the middle of her chest from where Evie's sword had gone right through her. The athru who'd held Evie back. It hadn't been an athru at all, but an illusion by the creature inside her. Evie could still hear her laughter as she checked Laura for vital signs. She turned to Box. "Get Zax, now!" But Zax was already running over, a medical kit in her hands. Evie turned back to Laura. "Just hold on, baby, please. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean." "Captain, I need you to move," Zax said, falling on her knees on the other side of Laura. Evie's face was wet with tears. "I can't leave her. I can't." A metal arm appeared underneath her armpit and lifted her up and away. "No, I can't leave her. You don't understand. I love her. I can't." "Captain, please," Box said. "You need to give the doctor space." He barely registered in Evie's mind. All she could focus on was Laura lying there, motionless. "No," Evie said, struggling. She was strong enough to break out of Box's grip. She just had to focus her new energy. But that same energy might have just killed the woman she loved. As soon as that thought went through her mind, her knees folded, and she fell to the ground, partially supported by Box, and wailed. Still, she tried clawing her way back over to Laura. A second later, she felt a sharp prick in her neck, and then the world went dark. 40. "Okay," Jan said. "Prepare to fire the main thrusters." Cas reached down to the primary thruster control, his hand shaking. He'd never flown anything that had more than just a normal control panel. But the interior of a space wing was much more hands-on. It had a joystick, which Jan said gave them faster response times than hitting a few buttons on a panel, as well as a series of inputs and dials all over the board. It was a lot for him to try and take in. But he could do this, right? "Boss?" Box's voice cut in through his comm with Jan. "Box? What's the situation?" He didn't touch the thruster control yet. He needed to make sure he wasn't distracted, as it was the last step to get him up in the air. "We need you back at camp." There was something strange in his voice, and Cas didn't like any part of it. He'd heard that voice before, and immediately double-tapped his comm to switch it over to a secure channel. "What's wrong? What happened?" "The captain. She was under some kind of influence. She hurt a lot of people." Cas disengaged all of the ship's systems, dropping all the power levels back to 0. The canopy opened, and ladder extended again, and he jumped out as fast as he could. "Exactly what happened? Where are the athru?" "She killed the last 2, he replied. "But then she didn't stop. She attacked some of the crew. Me, Marshall, and Laura." "Oh, Cor," Cas replied. He sprinted over to Jan, who stared at him with wide eyes, mouthing, "What's wrong?" "I'm on my way." "Just go," Jan said. "I'll be fine here." "I'm not leaving you here alone," Cas replied, helping her back onto his back. He hunched forward, grabbing her legs, and took off jogging back toward camp. "What's going on?" Jan asked, her voice unsure. Cas didn't reply, only kept his head down and focused on where his feet were going. He didn't need to trip over an errant root and send them both spilling. Evie had attacked the crew? Even Laura? Nothing about this could be good. He let go of one of Jan's legs long enough to tap his comm again. "Box?" "Yeah, boss." "Can you move the wounded? Can you get everyone to working shuttles? We need to get back to the ship as soon as possible." The words came out in groups as Cas struggled to keep his breath and to keep moving at the same time. "Zax is moving some of them now, but the others? There's no point." Cas winced and picked up the pace. Behind him, Jan said nothing else, and the only sounds were Cas's constant huffing and time with his footfalls on the jungle floor. They reached the edge of camp, and Cas brought them into view. Off to the side lay the last 2 athru, cut down by Evie's sword, while near the shuttle they hadn't managed to repair lay at least 6 bodies, all of them members of the crew. Cas looked away from all the blood and saw Talia standing over the immobile body of Evie. "Set me down here," Jan said. "Go, take care of business. I'll be fine." Cas nodded and set her down gently, then ran over to Talia. "Is she?" "He told me to watch over her," she replied. "He said the alien knocked her out before attacking the others, but—" She indicated Zax hunched over Laura's body, and Cas's heart fell. If they couldn't save her, Evie might never recover. It was one thing to lose the person you loved, but to be the cause of their demise? It might be too much for her to take. "What about—" Cas glanced around, looking for Marshall. "Box moved him into one of the other shuttles already," Talia said. "I don't think he has long." "Get the captain aboard the shuttle. We're leaving right now. Help Jan back on his ship. Her ankles are broken. And make sure we have everyone who's left." Cas didn't mean to shout, but he was angry. Angry at this entire situation. Angry at himself for not being here to stop Evie. Angry at her for succumbing to whatever it was that did this. Angry at the athru and everything they represented. He didn't care what it took. If they had to fly back to Coalition space in a cardboard box, he'd find a way to make it happen. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. They'd found a way to tear them all apart, physically and mentally, and Cas wasn't going to let it happen to anyone else in the Coalition. But they sure as hell weren't staying here a second longer than they needed to. After motioning to some of the crew to help Talia with Jan and Evie, Cas ran over to Zax. "Doc, we're returning to the ship in the good shuttles. We need to move her." "I'm not sure it will do any good," Zax replied, hanging her head. "I can't save her." "Is she—" "She was gone the minute the blade pierced her heart," Zax replied. "If she'd been on the ship, and I could have gotten to her immediately, maybe. But with this much blood loss—" Cas couldn't believe it. How was he going to tell Evie? And how would she ever forgive herself? "Okay," he replied, his voice surprisingly calm. "Load her on the shuttle anyway. We're not leaving her here for—" He gestured all around them. Zax nodded. "Yes, sir." "All of them, Cas added. I don't want to leave anyone behind. Cas watched as the doctor lifted Laura's lifeless body, carrying it over to the closest shuttle. He jogged over to the nearest dead alien Evie had killed, staring at his strange face. He had hoped maybe to find one of them alive, one who could still provide them with information about their intentions. Though, as he looked around, it seemed their intent was clear: extermination. Even if that meant they get the humans to destroy themselves, this small demonstration might be nothing more than a prelude to their real plan. Cas huffed, walking back to the shuttles. They'd take the ships back into orbit, collect Sester, Zenfor, and Wave 3, and set off for the Bulak hub. They didn't have a choice. Perhaps they'd be able to find another ship that Zenfor could modify to get them all back home in time. It was clear they couldn't stay here, no matter what. 4 people ran off toward the space wings. The pilots? Cas asked Jan, as he approached where she was propped up inside the back of one of the shuttles. She nodded. We'll have to send someone back for the ships at the first camp. Raffi volunteered to take my ship back. We may not have the personnel. Cas hopped into the back of the shuttle. It seemed most everything had been packed, though the command shuttle sat empty due to the athru having destroyed its engines. Where's Box? Jan pointed further into the shuttle. Down there with Marshall. He doesn't think he's going to make the trip. Cas turned to another crewman loading up the last of the supply crates. Get this hatch shut immediately. Yes, sir, the crewman said, securing the crate. Are you okay back here? He asked Jan. She'd been strapped into one of the cargo nets. Yeah, I'll be fine. It's easier than someone trying to move me into crew quarters. She gave him a weak smile. How's the lieutenant? Cas cut his eyes to the floor. She didn't make it. He shook his head. I need to talk to Marshall. She pursed her lips. Good luck. As Cas made his way through the cargo area to the crew quarters, he heard the back hatch of the shuttle seal. He found Box leaning over a semi-conscious Marshall. The man had blood everywhere, and it dripped onto the floor from the bed. 2 other beds held the bodies of 2 of Evie's victims. On the highest one was Evie herself, still unconscious. Be right back, Cas said, passing Box and Marshall. He made it all the way to the front. As soon as everyone is confirmed as a go, take off, but, and this is imperative, all the shuttles need to leave the atmosphere at the exact same time. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Ensign Rivers said. We'll coordinate with the other 2 and the Space Wing pilots. Cas returned to the crew area where Box had managed to apply some kind of salve to Marshall's wound, but he was still coughing up blood. He's definitely not human, Box said. His organs are not in the right places. I'm not even sure what half of them are. Cas leaned down. Marshall, can you hear me? The man's eyes fluttered, and he coughed again, blood dotting his bushy beard. I need to know where the athru are right now. When will they arrive at Earth? His eyes fluttered again, then focused on Cas. He reached up, grabbing his jacket with surprising strength. You have to protect her, even from herself. Find Esterva. She can help. Who is Esterva? Cas asked. The deck plating shuddered as the shuttle took off. Marshall let go of his jacket and produced a small black orb from his pocket. He pressed it, and it glowed the same blue as the controls down at the pyramid had. Hold on to this. Find Esterva. Tell her I did everything. He coughed again, the wet sound coming from deep in his lungs, if they were lungs. Shit, Box said. He's going. Cas shook the man. Marshall, where are the athru right now? But the man had stopped moving. His chest no longer rose and fell. Cas sat back on the floor, examining the small orb. Turbulence shook the shuttle as Box checked Marshall's vitals, his one useless arm still hanging at his side. I've recorded time of death for the ship's log. Yeah, Cas said, his mind back at what had been their camp. He dropped his voice. How many people did she end up killing? 8, Box replied.
She tried to get me, but—" He indicated his shoulder, where Cas noticed a nick in the metal.
"Did she stop on her own, or—"
"She seemed to realize it when she hit me. Of course, by then it was too late. Before that, she was going after anyone close to her. I guess she thought they were all athru. We tried to stop her, but—"
"How many people saw?" Cas asked.
"What? Who else saw what happened?" Cas said, his voice urgent. "I don't think anyone. She killed everyone who were close," Box replied. "Commander, we are breaching the atmosphere now," Rivers said through the comm. Cas slipped the orb into his pocket and stood. "Hold down the fort. We'll transfer the bodies to the stasis pods in the morgue when we get back, before we go in search of help." Box nodded, his one eye blinking a sympathetic pattern. It had been a long time since Cas had seen that one, and it warmed his heart to see Box hadn't become completely cynical. He made his way back into the cockpit, where the familiar blackness of space stretched out before them. He never thought he'd be so happy to see space in his life. "Coming up under starboard bow," Rivers said, working the controls with her mechanical hands. "Everyone make it through at the same time?" Cas asked, thankful they hadn't had to go through the same storm as when they'd arrived. River nodded. "Yes, sir. Everyone is accounted for." As they approached Tempest, Cas felt a strange sensation in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right about the ship. It looked too new. "Ensign, pull alongside the hull. Level with Deck 11, Cas said, squinting. The ship was still some distance away, but he could definitely see there had been some changes. "Aye," Rivers said, and the shuttle moved up and over so Cas had a good look at the side of the ship. "Sir, it's been repaired." "It has," Cas said. In fact, the entire ship looked like it was almost new. What the hell? "Incoming comm." River tapped a button on the controls. "It's from Tempest." "Go ahead, Tempest," Cas said. "Welcome back," Zenfor said. Cas cocked his head. It was Zenfor's voice, but it sounded different somehow. "We thought you might never make it." "What do you mean?" Cas asked. "We were only on the planet for a day or so. It should have seemed like seconds up here. There's a time dilation effect on the planet." "Yes, we know," Zenfor replied. "You've been gone for almost 18 years. This has been PlanetFall, Infinity's End, Book 6, by Eric Warren. Narrated by Larry Gorman. Copyright 2019 by Eric Warren. Production copyright 2020 by Eric Warren.